And a simple, very first hypothesis, if certain powerful actors, countries or others, do not find their interest realized by a given set of institutions or by a dominant institution in their field, they eventually tend to create and sustain, as a benevolent hegemon or as a coercive hegemon, alternative institutional arrangements. Of course, conditions apply, which we know well from the reluctance, action cost, decision structures, and so forth, that might first have to be overcome before this happens. In general, as you will hear from Sylvia and Jeff, that's what we find with climate change. Namely, with the many unilateral agreements that the George W. Bush administration in the US and the Howard administration in Australia then at the time have brought into this world in parallel to the Kyoto Protocol, which they heavily developed. So more about this in a minute. Interest-based explanations is also a simple one, directly related from situation structural arguments or neoliberal institutionalism in general, is of course take the power argument out and simply say we have a high degree of fragmentation wherever we find asymmetric constellations of interest among key actors. Dilemma game structures, non-regime conducive games, and so forth. Also a simple argument. I'm not claiming this is highly sophisticated, but it's intriguing. It's intriguing to what extent this still has not been brought into the literature. And I think that's, for example, the biggest problem of Kyoto skeptics or of fragmentation friends, or however you like to call them, that it's quickly argued that Kyoto is overburdened or the climate regime is overburdened. Yes, it is not working. Yes, it is too big. But let's not kid ourselves. The stuff we teach to our students is international relations theories, right? So we talk about reasons. These phenomena are factors, are functions of other factors, like underlying constellations of interest. There is a reason why we have a certain regime design. There's a reason why the climate regime is overloaded. And we have to look into that. If we don't do that, we might find the same problems resurfacing. If a constellation of actors is not favorable within the climate regime, why should it suddenly be in a different setting, in a plethora of other institutional arrangements out there? That's a question I still would like to see answered. So we have to do more work, also deductively, not only inductively or empirically. Quickly, some other examples. Big literature out there, also in the field of institutional interlinkages, for example, by our institutional fit literature. And that goes in particular for environmental problems. We're talking about complex problems, right? So of course certain environmental problems are more amenable, or more amenable to, or better served by a highly fragmented institutional complex than others. Let me quickly get normative again. Again, I'm trying not to claim that fragmentation is a bad thing. For certain issues, and we have nice typologies in our literature, like talking about common pool problems versus local cumulative environmental problems. For certain issues, it might actually be better not to go centralized. Think of forests, think of rivers, maybe also the high seas. Problems that at least originate in a confined space and only eventually, cumulatively, have a global or transboundary effect. And this, by the way, would also be a perfect way of starting to look beyond environment and join hands with other types of literature. Also domestic-oriented literatures that tell us which types of problems should be rather, or are rather, authoritatively regulated, or are rather network-wise, deliberatively regulated, and so forth. I quickly go down the line with other arguments. An argument that obviously lends itself to this whole kind of literature, and that Michael Cyrn and Benjamin Fowler are also forging in our special issue with their contribution, is that we should look more into social differentiation theory, or a new type of neo-functionalism. Basically stating that fragmentation is just a natural result of the spillover effects that functionalists have already been witnessing decades ago. I would still challenge this argument a bit and ask, should we really take it that easy and say that we find neo-functionalism corroborated or confirmed by the fragmentation we find? I would say no, at least when we see that some of this fragmentation is dysfunctional and that all these institutions are neatly hanging together. Then we cannot claim that there's simply a division of labor out there. Brings us back to how do we define coherence, division of labor, and a nicely functioning set of institutions. Other arguments I could tell you, Robert Faulkner, for example, Kate O'Neill trying to build more on the English school, on the word polity approach, and saying that it doesn't matter if secondary institutions are fragmented, the most important thing is to have a dominant primary institutions behind it. Some final arguments, leaving a bit the interest-based and power-based realm, looking at knowledge-based, constructivist hypothesis. Simple ideas here. Cognitivism, obviously, we will find fragmentation in issue areas where you have competing knowledge claims. Issue areas with a high degree of uncertainty. Think of carbon markets, different ways to design them. Discussion about carbon border adjustments. It's obvious why we have so many different bilateral approaches to them, for example. So also in that regard, I guess a straightforward hypothesis, which still needs, of course, explanation. You can do the same with norms-based discussions. We had a discussion, I guess yesterday also, where Peter Haas said, we don't have the right norms in place to really bring Rio Plus 20 forward. Maybe because we have too much norm contestation out there, competing knowledge claims. Just one example, plant genetic resources. My colleague Christian Rosendahl once said there's an arms race going on in that field, with different institutions emerging or proposing different types of approaches you might have to plant genetic resources, natural sovereignty versus more private ownership. And indeed, you have a big clash of these institutions on different normative understandings. And if you like, the last point relating to Stephen Bernstein and his idea of a neoliberal environmentalism informing global environmental governance today, let's reach hands out to our discourse-based colleagues. Obviously, we cannot speak of causes then, but rather of interpretations. You might also say that apart from discourse contestation, we simply live in a time where we have a dominant market-based or network-based paradigm. And then we should not be so astonished that we also find a market of institutions out there. We can look beyond IR theory. That's my last slide on courses, and then I will rush through the rest in 2 minutes. Sorry. We should also look beyond IR theory. Like, for example, Frank Bierman has done with his colleagues in the Global Governance Project. They look at other types of theories. For example, organizational behavior studies, organization studies, looking into institutional turf wars, factors like bureaucratic leadership. All these can inform us more about why we have fragmentation to a certain degree or why we don't have it. So much for our ideas for a follow-up project, how we can really analyze in a more fundamental way based on our theories why we have a degree of fragmentation. And why should we do that? Why should we look at this based on these theories? Simply because if you want to make clear-cut suggestions on defragmentation and on responses, you have to know what the causes are. And you have to get a clearer idea of how these different factors hang together, how they contradict each other, which ones are dominant, of the mix of it. Actually, not so much of a complicated research program after all, is it? Consequences, theme number 3. If institutions matter, then obviously institutional complexity matters for different issues. And we would argue that not so much as an independent variable, but more like an intervening variable, with the underlying factors more being the causes, which I have just presented. But then, of course, fragmentation does something, complexity does something. For output effectiveness, for equity, legitimacy, for actors, and it also matters across scales. You will hear from Sylvia and Jeff how it matters, for example, for legitimacy. Amandine Orsini has a different contribution in our special issue, where she argues that actors, non-state actors which have strong organizational power are actually favored by fragmentation because they can attend the meetings, they can process the information. Weaker actors, vulnerable actors, are put worse off, obviously. So fragmentation is kind of qualifying or strengthening certain effects we're already witnessing. And responses, we will hear from Sebastian on different types of fragmentation management. He had a typology out in a different paper where this was relating to interplay. And just a word on this again. When we talk about options and limits for fragmentation management, we had this talk about centrality and defragmentation, and this excellent, now award-winning paper by our colleague Rukyat Kim. What we are not saying here is that managing fragmentation means going back to centrality. Not at all. It doesn't mean more institutions, or it doesn't mean more, like again, a big convolute of functions with one institution. It means maneuvering, navigating, orchestrating, coordinating different types of institutions. So it doesn't necessarily mean going back to centralization. Last slides. Again, to conclude, the findings of a special issue, framing of fragmentation vary significantly depending on your discipline, your standpoints, and so forth. Second, what I try to explain most, fragmentation may be explained by very different strands of theories, and we still have to get into this. Third, fragmentation matters, for example, across scales as an intervening variable. It amplifies legitimacy gaps, organizational power gaps, and so on. And last but not least, and that's what we're going to hear from Sebastian, that's his argument, or one of his arguments, that management approaches are confronted with a considerable stability out there again. Basically like, we have a new interinstitutional balance that has eventually been reached, but more about this from Sebastian in his case then. And I guess Harold will kill me if I go through this again, so I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And I'm a pretty lovely person, so I wouldn't do that, of course, to you.